Hello. We are in Deuteronomy chapter 14, and someday I'm going to cut together the first probably 10 seconds of each one of these videos into just one long video of me saying, hello, here we go. This is my favorite book. This is not my favorite book, but it is a very important book and or chapter, and it is it's controversial. So I'll just get to the point here. If I didn't say anything in Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, or Numbers that totally threw you off and said, hey, I'm out of here, I don't want to hear any of that heresy or whatever it is, or I don't like that version of God, I want my version of God. And maybe you went running to a certain pastor and said, hey, this guy needs to be kicked out of here. If none of that happened, you might be okay. But chapter 14 is one of those chapters that explains some of why we don't eat certain foods. I understand the love of bacon. I understand the love of pork butt. I get it. But my argument is not that you should do something like meat. My argument is let's see what God said and let's deal with it and figure out what it is that God's saying to you. That's the goal. So some of what I'm going to say is probably going to, like I said, if it hadn't happened before, you might be okay. But if you've been offended more times than one with me, some of this might be a little bit hard to take. But that's okay. You're going to be okay. We are not talking about salvation. We are not talking about you getting excommunicated from the church or killed or anything like that. Unless you're a pastor, then of course you probably should consider what you say to other pastors. Sometimes they do not like to be told these kind of things. So that's a long-winded way of saying, let's jump into Deuteronomy chapter 14. And I'm going to jump back and forth because there's some things that really are not said well in the English version. And so the Complete Jewish Bible has it kind of worded a little bit better, a little bit more accurate. So Deuteronomy chapter 14 in the New Living Translation says this: since you are the people of the Lord your God, never cut yourselves or shave the hair above your foreheads in mourning for the dead. You have been set apart as holy to the Lord your God, and he has chosen you from all the nations of the earth to be his own special treasure. The Complete Jewish Version says it this way: you are the people of Adonai your God. You are not to gash yourselves or shave your hair above your foreheads in mourning for the dead, because you are a people set apart as holy for Adonai your God. Adonai your God has chosen you to be his unique treasure out of all the peoples on the face of the earth. What I really like about that wording is it says, because you are a people set apart. You're not supposed to be like everybody else. You know, I used to think, I think every teenager thinks, I just want to be normal. It's like, no, God did not call you to be normal. God did not call you to get along to get along. That's not what God says in his word. He's saying agree with me, and everybody that disagrees with you is wrong. Just agree with God. Focus on what God said and let everybody else deal with it on their own. So this is one of my favorite verses in the Bible, and I've been accused of heresy before because I said that God says not to eat lima beans, because I grew up with lima beans, and lima beans are disgusting. And I was forced to eat them, and I don't eat them anymore because of Deuteronomy 14, verse 3 in the Complete Jewish Bible says this, and this is clear as a bell: you are not to eat anything disgusting. I wished I knew that verse when I was a little kid. I would have told my mom, I shouldn't have to eat this because it is disgusting and it's against God's word. So let's move forward. I know that's just me, but the animals which you may eat are ox, sheep, goat, deer, gazelle, roebuck, ibex, antelope, uh, oryx, and mountain sheep. Any animal that has a separate hoof that is completely divided and also chews the cud, these animals you may eat. But you are not to eat those that only chew the cud or only have a divided hoof. For example, the camel, the hare, and the coney are unclean for you because they chew the cud but don't have a separate hoof. While the pig is unclean for you because, although it has a separate hoof, it doesn't chew the cud. You are not to eat the meat from these or touch their carcasses. Now, let's address the other controversy that I always get hit with. Well, didn't we abolish all the food laws? Yeah, we did. People did. God didn't. Jesus didn't. I've not found it yet. And if you go to Acts 10, that's not it. So uh, my thing is, there's a reason he said to do or to not do something. That's all I'm asking people to explore. It doesn't say there's no reason why we can't do whatever we want. It doesn't say that he didn't explain why. He says, while the pig is unclean for you because it has a separate hoof, but it doesn't chew the cud. Now, we can argue all day whether that's a good reason or a bad reason, but we would all be wrong because God said it, it's a good reason. That's all we got to know. He doesn't say pork's bad. He doesn't say they're inherently terrible. He's saying that for you, they're not food. That's it. Now, please send all email correspondence and complaints to anybody but me. But I'm just kidding. We can talk about it. Absolutely, let's talk about it. You are not going to go to hell because you ate bacon. You are not going to go to heaven because you didn't. This is not a salvation issue. This is an obedience issue. For me, is if God said it, I need to find a way, or at least pray about a way to do it. Figure it out. That's all I'm asking you to do. Don't change your life instantly. Ask God, approach him and ask him what he wants you to do with all of that. Now, one of the reasons that we don't talk about this kind of stuff in church is because if you go over to the English version, we've taken some of the words and mixed them up so it doesn't seem like certain things are still true. It says this in verse 3. It says, you must not eat any detestable animals that are ceremonially unclean. These are the animals you may eat: the ox, the sheep, the goat, the deer, the gazelle, the roe deer, the wild goat, the addax, the antelope, and the mountain sheep. You may eat any animal that has completely split hooves and chews the cud. But if an animal doesn't have both, it may not be eaten. So you may not eat the camel, the hare, or the hyrax. Where we go? They chew the cud, but do not have split hooves. So they are ceremonially unclean for you. And you may not eat the pig. It has split hooves, but does not chew the cud. So it is ceremonially, look how they've added in ceremonially, unclean for you. You may not eat the meat of these animals or even touch their carcasses. So one of the reasons they add the word ceremonially is because they're trying to separate the ritual, the just activities that happen from what God actually wants. But you can't do that because there's no such thing as a clean pig. Pork is just unclean. There's not a version in any ceremony or any ritual where it would be clean. So there's no reason to call it ceremonial. Now that's just kind of my thing, so I jump on it sometimes. So of all that lives in the water, you may eat these. Anything in the water that has fins and scales, these you may eat. But whatever lacks fins and scales, you are not to eat. It is unclean for you. You may eat any clean bird, but you are not to eat: eagles, vultures, ospreys, kites, any kind of buzzard, any kind of raven, ostriches, screech owls, seagulls, any kind of hawk, little owls, great owls, horned owls, pelicans, barn owls, cormorants, storks, or any kind of heron, hoopoes, and bats. All winged, swarming creatures are unclean for you. They are not to be eaten. But all clean flying creatures you may eat. Now, how would you know what that means if you didn't study Leviticus and you didn't get the food laws? You wouldn't know a lot of that stuff. So you are not to eat any animal that dies naturally, although you may let a stranger staying with you eat it or sell it to a foreigner, because you are a holy people for Adonai your God. Sometimes the argument is, well, I think they got rid of the food laws, and so, God's not convicted me on this yet. And I get all of that. But when God says, because you are a holy people, that's why we should do things. Sometimes when our kids are like, well, I didn't really want to do it. Well, I don't need you to want to do it, a deep passion desire for it. I need you to do it because you were set aside as a holy people in our family. We have an obligation to our God. So if he set us apart for it, how was Paul or Peter abolishing the food laws? Why would everybody else other than God say, I don't know, but it's because we were set apart. And yes, you're thinking, he's a little preachy today. I get it. You are not to boil a young animal in its mother's milk. Every year you are to take 1/10 of everything your seed produces in the field and eat it in the presence of Adonai your God. In the place where he chooses to have his name live, you will eat the 10th of your grain, new wine and olive oil, and the firstborn of your cattle and sheep, so that you will learn to fear Adonai your God always. So let me back up real quick because I'm in that mood. You're not to boil a young animal's mother's milk is a pagan ritual. That's why they didn't want you to do it. And we'll go more into that, but that's why that just kind of popped up. That was a pretty popular thing because they were appeasing all kinds of pagan gods and stuff like that. Also, good news, we have the Holy Spirit. We are this place where his Spirit chooses to dwell. So he's with us always. So some of what we're reading, we're like, wow, in the place where his name lived, you will eat the grain and the wine and the olive oil and the firstborn of your cattle and sheep, so that you will learn to fear God. You're going to eat it in the presence of the God Almighty. That's something we should have fear and trembling about. But in the distance, if the distance is too great for you so that you are unable to transport it because the place where Adonai chooses to put his name is too far from you, then when Adonai your God prospers you, you are to convert it into money, take the money with you, go to the place which Adonai your God will choose, and exchange the money for anything you want, cattle, sheep, wine, other intoxicating liquor, or anything you please, and you are to eat there in the presence of Adonai your God and enjoy yourselves, you and your household. The God of wrath is in the Old Testament. He's sitting there telling you, go get some food and some liquor and hang out. Don't take me literally. I mean, that's literally what he's saying, but he's not saying get drunk or anything like that. So, and you're to eat it there in the presence of Adonai your God and enjoy yourselves, you and your household. Everybody come with us. But we sometimes don't just be with God. That's part of what the Sabbath is. The Shabbat is to just be with God and your family. Let's take some time to just enjoy God's blessings and everything that he's given us. But don't neglect the Levite staying with you, because he has no share or inheritance like yours. At the end of every 3 years, you are to take all the tenths of your produce from that year and store it in your towns. Then Levi, because he has no share or inheritance like yours, along with the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow living in your towns will come and eat and be satisfied, so that Adonai your God will bless you in everything your hands produce. So remember, they don't get an allotment of land, and it's the tribe of Levi, and I'm an American, so I call it Levi too. But so what he's saying is, well, you got to support them even in these sanctuary cities. Everywhere that they live, you're supposed to help take care of them. So God says that Israel is Benai Yehovah, and that means sons of God. Bene, Benai Yehovah, sons of God, or sons of Jehovah. Verse 3, it talks about diet. For Hebrews, that which is prohibited is not food. So even though technically I could eat the wax out of a candle, it's not food. No one considers that food. Maybe a couple of people, but so there is food and then there are edible things. Until Jehovah instructed Adam and Eve, there were no rules. That was the only rule: don't eat from the tree of knowledge. And the very first law ordained concerned food. Don't eat from that tree. So sin could occur because there was a rule to break. You can't, if there's no rules, there's no way to break those rules and there's no way to sin. But that was the first sin, or the first rule, so it resulted in the first sin. So there are two realms of choice: moral choice and then preference. So in the moral choice realm, the Lord laid down boundaries in the Torah. Those are all moral decisions he laid down for us. So man wants to change items from the moral choice to the realm of the preference. So the realm of moral choice is governed by God's will, his laws and commands. Preference has been given for man to choose. So things which no divine law has been created, so right and wrong don't really apply. Kind of like, cold water versus hot water, or I like Coke or I like Pepsi. Those are preferences. So God's command against homosexuality is being moved into the realm of preference. This is just rebellion. I don't really want this to be a moral decision. I want it to be a preference. So I'm going to start calling it this. So the day the church decided that there is no law, or it doesn't really apply to us, we gave ourselves all choices into the realm of preference, our preference. So we got to restructure all of our worship, how we did things. You got to use wine, or you got to use grape juice, or challah bread, or plastic wrappers, or whatever it is. We moved basically everything into the choice realm, the preference realm. So, and it became our preference, not necessarily God's preference. So the day Christianity said Jesus came to abolish the law is the day the church declared total freedom from moral choice. Now it's all preference. How do I feel about this? Premarital sex, homosexuality, getting drunk, murder, whatever it is. It's up to me now to decide whether it's right or wrong. We just put everything into preferences. So denominations have declared that what salvation saves us from is the divine law. We're saved from the law. Most of us have heard that in a church. We're saved from the law. And it makes such a difference because one word changes that. We're saved from the curse of the law. And that's very different, because otherwise everything's a preference. There is no moral code anymore that we're supposed to follow. Every denomination gets to come up with whatever code they want. So salvation saves us from the consequence of violating the law. And what other definition of sin is there? Well, with law, there's sin. Without law, there can be no sin. So since there's nothing to violate, there's no way to sin. And it's a circular argument. I get that, because if you believe that you can still sin, what are you sinning against? And I know people are like, well, against God. Okay, how do you know that God's against that? His word. That's the only way to know. So if Yeshua abolished the law, then there was no need to go to the cross, because there wouldn't be any sins to atone for. So even if you read the Sermon on the Mount where he says he didn't, but you still believe he did, why did he go to the cross? Because there was no more moral code if he abolished the law. So there was nothing to atone for. So this principle is validated by Paul. In Romans 4:13, it says, "For the promise to Abraham or to his descendants that he would be heir of the world was not through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if those who are of the law are heirs, faith is made void and the promise is nullified. For the law brings about wrath, but where there is no law, neither is there violation. So I can't break the law if the law doesn't exist. I can't break a board if there's no board there. So the first half of this statement is easy to understand. No one is saved by the law. Most of us all kind of at one point or another said, well, yeah, we understand that. Salvation comes by faith in the Messiah. We're all on board with that one. But the law was never meant to save. That was never the intent. It's not like it almost did or he wanted it to and it just didn't work. That was never the intent. Nowhere in the Torah do we find anything about salvation or redemption through the law. In fact, he redeemed everybody before he even gave them the law. So that argument just doesn't make any sense. Pastors have used this to say that the law is inherently bad. And with the advent of Jesus Christ, the law was abolished and there are no laws for the Christian to follow. That's the only logical conclusion. So the new believer understands we have rules and boundaries set down by God. Even the most immature believers know that when we cross those boundaries and violate those rules, we've sinned. Somebody who's just heard about Christ this morning and set foot in a church for the first time the last 5 minutes ago knows murder's wrong. That's called the natural law. We studied some of that. People inherently know right and wrong. So when we say, well, we just kind of make up the rules as we go along, what are we telling a new believer? So those are my questions. So the better question for us is, when will that stop? Like, when will all of the rules and boundaries and stuff stop? When will it go away if it hadn't already? Well, the answer's in Matthew, in the New Testament, Matthew chapter 5, 17 through 19. It says, For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass away from the law until it is all accomplished. So when the existing heaven and earth pass away, and when the world is made new at the end of the 1,000-year reign of the Messiah, then conditions will be similar to creation after Adam and Eve. Only then will there be no laws, no moral choices, and no possibilities of sin. You will not be able to sin because there's not moral choices. Everything's perfected. So what changed? Why do we get to live that way now with our own moral law or changing the moral law because we just want to? So the Lord used food to make distinctions, to show he divides and separates. He prohibits and he permits. Dividing and separating is the primary characteristic of God, and it shows us what he approves of and what he disapproves of. The act of salvation is dividing and separating because some will gain salvation and some won't. It's about separation. So God began dividing and separating when he divided the land from the water, when he divided the night from the day, when he divided good from evil. He eventually divided and separated mankind into tribes, then nations. Then he divided and separated the nation of Israel from all others. Then he divided and separated the tribe of Levi away and divided them even further into priest and non-priest. So if you've studied the Torah with us, you see God divides, elects, and separates. You can't be set apart if you're with everybody else. So he divided food into suitable and unsuitable. The foods themselves don't have any direct inherent health benefits or negatives to them. The idea that the list of biblically clean foods was based on hygiene and health is just incorrect. It's just his choice. I don't know why he chose me either. I disagree with that choice a lot of times. I'm like, I'm not worthy. I don't deserve what God's given me, but he chose me. It's not up to me to argue about it. It's to accept it and move forward. So the Lord states that the reason for requiring Israel to eat kosher now, the rabbis over the last couple of thousand years have added a ton of kosher rules. I'm talking about biblical kosher, not kosher rules, halakha, doctrine, those kind of things. So he says that the reason is that Israel is holy and following God's dietary laws is one of the requirements for maintaining their holiness when accomplished within the context of trusting and loving Jehovah. So what he's saying is this shows obedience. Because I said it, that's why you do it, not because you disagree with I said it. So by dividing and separating food, the Lord is giving us a spiritual principle too. So he declares what is holy and everything else is not. So holy things are intended only for holy people. So unholy things are not to go into his temple where he dwells. That's why. So a set apart people should only eat food that has been set apart. That's the principle he's trying to teach here. So every procedure, ritual, animal, instrument, object, or law that God deems to be holy is holy because he deems it. He's the one that has that authority. And it maintains that holiness when it is used in the proper context, but not when it's not. So you, as a disciple of Yeshua, Jesus the Christ, are holy because God made a determination to give you a holy status and you accepted it. And if you demonstrate your trust in him by means of faith in his Son, he will consider your sins paid for, your relationship with him restored, and give you eternal life. That's the gospel. He's saying, that's what you do. He offered it, we accepted it, and we demonstrate that by living that way. That's it. Not perfectly, but living in a way that we are grateful. So no Hebrew is to eat anything disgusting or abominable. In Hebrew, to'eva, T-O''E-V-A-H. The idea is to not eat the things that the Lord has set apart as food is the most displeasing thing to him. It's an abomination to him. Not my words, these are God's words. So to'eva is reserved for things that are especially unclean, unholy, unlawful, and have no place in the life of God's people. Especially the people that call the God of Israel their God. Because if there's a list of 5 things that are horrifying to your wife, you wouldn't do those 5 things. Like you would pay attention to that. So in verses, like none of us would eat earthworms because those aren't food, but we could physically eat them. Worms might be edible, but they're not biblically food. So it works the same way later in the Bible. Unclean food is not spoken of or classified because if it's unclean, it's not food. There's no such thing as, food that's unclean, because it's like if he didn't say it was clean for us, it's not clean for us. We're okay with that, and we're going to follow that. So in verses 4 and 5, a number of animals are listed as food and therefore clean. Only 3 of those are domesticated, and the rest are wild game. Canaan had an abundance of wild game too. So verse 6 says it must both chew the cud and have a hoop that is separated. And verse 7 says, camels, airs, and coney do chew the cud, but they don't have a separated hoop. So they're not clean. Pigs are unclean because they don't chew the cud. Sea creatures must have fins and scales. So things like eels, shellfish, lobster, crab, shrimp, whale, squid, not food. We're given a list of birds that are unclean. Presumably all the others are clean. We're never really told. Chicken's always been considered good and clean for Hebrews. The key word in some of that, swarming in Hebrew, is sherets, S-H-E-R-E-T-S. Sherets refers to living creatures that swarm or crawl, ants, bees, stuff like that. We get some prohibitions about when cleaning animals can be eaten. If they died of a natural death, they may not be eaten. An animal that has died from natural causes may be given to the gur or sold to what's called the nokri, which is N-O-K-R-I. So a gur is basically just a non-Hebrew who lives among Israel and has agreed to be part of the community, but they've not joined a tribe in an official capacity. A Nokri is one who dwells alongside the Hebrews outside the camp. They just kind of come along with them. They're like in the suburbs. So the Hebrew is to offer it as a gift to the Gur who lives among them, but they can sell it to those that are not in the camp. So Israel's to follow different food laws than everybody else. They're separated, they're set apart. Rabbis expanded the rules of kosher eating, and Messiah said these and other traditions replaced God's word, and that was never a matter of what went into a person's mouth. So what he was saying is, y'all added all these rules, and the rules are really pretty simple. And this was not Jesus abandoning the law or even abolishing all dietary laws. He said in Matthew 5:17 that not one jot or stroke of a pen would be removed from the law until heaven and earth had passed away. So in Acts, when the sheet is let down in chapter 10, in case that's what you were writing, to say, oh, I can prove he did. Well, that's chapter 10 in Acts, and we've got a video on that. So go back and check that out. But Dwayne Christensen, he's the editor of the World Biblical Commentary, said this: Peter's vision of a great sheet let down by four corners upon the earth that contained all manner of unclean animals was primarily a symbolic communication on the matter of including Gentile man Cornelius with the people of God. So the vision was a metaphor. It is the only parable in the whole Bible that is considered literal instead of a metaphor by the church. Separate the Jewishness. I get it, but it took what was the primary symbol of Judaism, kosher eating, and used it as a metaphor for the Gentiles that God wanted included in his redemption plan. So he's using something they understand to make a point that the Gentiles are not inherently unclean. He wants them part of his plan. The Jews decided that Gentiles were unclean. And for a Jew to come into contact with the Gentile was, it defiled the Jews. So they didn't do it. Kosher dietary laws made it that a Jew could never eat food that a Gentile prepared. They couldn't eat in the Gentile's home or share a meal with them. So Peter saw that the Lord did not hold those man-made beliefs and told Peter Gentiles were not inherently unclean. So in time, Paul took that to mean that if a Gentile offered him food, then Paul should eat, because the need for the understanding and fellowship trumped the food laws for that situation. This will get a little technical, but trust me, stick with me here for a second. However, Paul never thought those laws were abolished. Rather, this was a demonstration of a concept called Kal Vachomer, Kalvhomer, the principle of light and heavy. So that when there's a clash between two God principles, then the one with the most weight must be chosen. We studied this back in an earlier book. Many of Israel's leaders will use fairness and compassion to drive them to do the things that the Lord has prohibited. And they use this as their excuse, really. Well, it's the kinder thing to do. He doesn't say do the kinder thing. He says do the weightier one. So this is the mentality of Joshua and his successors, all in the name of social justice and love and mercy. They'll all do things that Jehovah told them not to do with their foreign neighbors. So upon accepting the Jewish Messiah, and when we get into Joshua, you'll see this. They keep making deals. They didn't drive everybody out. Spoiler alert, it's still going on. So when we accept the Jewish Messiah, whose authority rests on the covenants between God and Israel, we cannot set aside God's laws and principles at our convenience. Because when you think about if Yeshua the Messiah is the Messiah of God sent because of a covenant, how do we have all of this, but somehow we get to just jump in there and change it? So we cannot count on love and mercy to dissolve all of this, the Lord's commands, and not to mix our worship, not to celebrate pagan holy days or mix those observances, nor to tolerate the presence of pagan gods. Like in my office here, I can't have pictures of like former girlfriends or other women I like. How would my wife feel about that? Well, when we blend other pagan things into our worship, we're bringing basically old girlfriends and boyfriends to your house, to his house, more importantly, I guess would be a better way to look at it. The values and principles of the Lord has given her better than those of the world. So they're always right, no matter what we think or feel. So I'll try to wrap this up. An annual tithe was to be given. The owner of the land, a tithe was generally taxes paid to the king. But here the tithe was used to support the tabernacle and all those who serve it. So because Israel was going to live spread out, we get the principle produce can be exchanged for money. So they wouldn't have to bring all of this to the temple. They could exchange it and then just bring the money, and then they could go get what they needed. So it was the duty of the tribes to support the Levites. They're separate from the priest, remember, because we covered this back in Leviticus. But the priest received most of the ritual sacrifices, and the Levites generally did not receive a portion of the sacrifices. So it was mostly from tithes and offerings that they got their support. So every 3 years, the annual tithes were to be stored in town. This was the Hebrew welfare system, basically. The food warehouse was available to all the widows and orphans and even foreigners. So the principle is that at all times, the interests of the poor stand before the Lord, and he looks to his people to fill that need, me and you. The God principle of release or remission is also shown. You know, release is shmitah in Hebrew, Shmittah, and it indicates a cancellation of one's indebtedness. So by faith in the Messiah, Yeshua, we are released from our debt to God and our servitude to sin. So he sets this up way back earlier in the Torah, but also in Deuteronomy, and then we'll bring it all the way forward to the New Testament when we see the Messiah. So it is in the Torah where we find this principle of release, and the New Testament expects us to already understand it. So when Jesus comes along, it's like, hey, that's the guy. Deuteronomy is Moses' Sermon on the Mount. It is Moses expanding on the law. Things are modified because living in tents was different than the way they're going to live in the Promised Land, in Canaan. So that's why we get a little bit of difference there. So God bless. I know this was long, but most of you are faithful and you love learning. So I hope this is helpful. If I said something that confused you or just really drove you nuts, please let me know. I promise I'm not going to get upset about it. I love you. God bless. Share this with a friend. Love God, love people, and change the world.